Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Affamie History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past, what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Welcome to Dis Affamie History with your host, Wendy Aris. Today, we've got a fantastic episode lined up. Wendy will be sitting down with Ernest Crim III, an anti-racist educator, author, and social media influencer, helps break down the significance of Black history in combating racism and empowering youth. Ernest shares his personal journey and how being the victim of a hate crime led to him becoming an educator. In this episode, they'll be diving into a topic that's both personal and powerful, discussing the book, How Black History Can Save Your Life. So settle in and let's get into the conversation.
I just wanted to thank you so much, Ernest Crim III, for coming on to the podcast, Dis Affamie History, discussing your book, How Black History Can Save Your Life. And I know for maybe some of my listeners out there, our viewers may have seen that this is two different subjects, but in reality, it really is not. It's two different approaches to the same thing in terms of how history can be very empowering to the trajectory of your life, to who you are, and what that actually means, moving forward, to be empowered by that knowledge. So before we start, if I can have you just briefly introduce yourself, Mr. Crim, that would be really great. Thank you.
Yes, I am. Based on my credentials, I would introduce myself as an Emmy-nominated producer, a former classroom teacher turned public teacher, and author of 2 books. At my core, I'm a student of life, a student of Black history that is committed to using Black history to empower communities, to educate, and to help us all strategize how to create more just and equitable societies and communities.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. And then, so we'll start. What inspired you to write How Black History Can Save Your Life, and how does it build upon your previous work of like Black History Saved My Life?
Yeah, so this book, How Black History Can Save Your Life, is essentially the second edition. I liken it to growing up. I had a lot of hip hop artists that I liked who were primarily from the South. And when I was growing up in the 90s, these artists struggled to get the support they wanted from major labels until people like Outkast came along and stuff like that. But even still, they still, for the most part, were selling their albums out of trunks and stuff like that. And what I often found was when they would get signed to that major label, they will put out their debut album, which was essentially just their debut major label album, but they had already released like majority of those songs on a previous independent release. And that's essentially what happened to me. I self-published Black History Saved My Life, and then I later signed with the independent publisher who gave me more access. And because it was coming up on the 5-year anniversary of the release, when I self-published it, I felt like it would be a great time to reintroduce myself, because when I first put it out, I didn't have a platform like I have now. I was mainly known to the audiences I spoke to. I was mainly known locally, and I did not have a TikTok or Instagram following to that degree. The thing that inspired me to create these 2 different versions, though, was a culmination of experiences growing up as a black man, black boy on the South Side of Chicago, and just always questioning society. And of course, living in the skin I live in proudly, you always have these questions of why do things appear to be different for people who look like me? And it just so happened that I was bused to a white neighborhood to go to school for 8 years. So as I'm growing older, of course, my close friends at that school are white, but then I'm noticing things that just don't make sense to me. Why, at the end of the day, are they walking home? But me and my friends get on a bus for 30 minutes at a time, right? Why does their neighborhood have more resources? Why do they have, more activities to engage in? Why do they have more stores? why don't I see any vacant lots? You know, like seriously, when you go through white neighborhoods, I can't even, I think that should be a new project for people, like, especially in the States. Go through a white neighborhood and see if you can spot one vacant lot. And if you do, it's in construction. They building a new Starbucks, Chick-fil-A, something like that. So this book was essentially all of those experiences plus high school plus college, with the, I guess you would say, the end date of when I dealt with the hate crime. So the hate crime I dealt with was ultimately the thing that catapulted me and in many ways forced me to say, okay, you have all of this information, all this knowledge, you have this unique perspective. Now it's time to share it with people, because if you don't share it, you could potentially not help someone the way you should be helping them.
Exactly. Your light is as a spark for somebody else. So then, that's how it's, kind of visioned and kind of viewed. And it's very similar in terms of, very interesting what you said in terms of being bussed in, because I can remember for myself as well, not necessarily being bussed in, but being one only Black person in your own class. So
Mhm.
definitely can relate to that as well.
Yeah.
And, would you discuss, how your personal experience as a hate crime survivor influenced the narratives and, of course, the lessons presented in the book?
Yeah, so I titled my book "How Black History Can Save Your Life," and it's a really bold title. It's something that I know when people come across it, it probably captures their attention, because what a bold thing to say, especially during these times. What do you mean a subject can save your life? I'll say that speaking from experience, and I say that because understanding if you are to say something is saving your life, that means that there's a force working against you to take your life away, whether it be immediately or gradually over time. So in that situation, when I dealt with this hate crime with my wife, July 30th of 2016, the context of America at that time was Trump was running for election for the first time. Um, the Black Lives Matter movement was probably on its second wave. And I say second wave because we know 2012, we're talking about Trayvon and people like that. 2016, we're talking about Sandra Bland. We're talking about Alton Sterling, Philando Castile. By 2020, of course, we know what happens with George Floyd. But in 2016, within our community, even though it probably wasn't worldwide at that point in time, we were still aware of these things. So while I'm at this event, it's essentially an outdoor party south side of Chicago towards the end of the summer. My wife and I decided we wanted to play a game called Cornhole before we left this event. This event was mostly Black and there were a few white folks. I just so happened to be right next to a group that had two white folks, two Black folks. It wasn't planned that way, it just happened that way. We decided to play this game, but there was only one beanbag available. But then we noticed the group next to us that I was speaking about, they threw their beanbag extremely far and they had like 15 other ones, I would say, and nobody went to grab that particular one. So my wife goes to grab that bag because she's assuming we'll be able to then use that. And a white lady in that group runs up to us and just starts screaming and yelling at us because we apparently to her, she felt like we took her property. So it escalates because neither one of us are going to capitulate to that. She just keeps screaming. So, okay, we scream back, you're not getting the bag back. At the same time, contextually, she's calling over the police. Like she's like calling and these are armed guards, armed police asking for help, of course, right? Like we did something to it. So when I say save my life in that instance, literally, right? It's okay. If I don't respond the appropriate way, this could lead to something not from her, but from them because of what she represents as a white woman in society. So I take out my phone as she's calling us. She begins to call us the N word. And so I take out my phone because I'm just so shocked, but also too aware that she's calling over the police. Like, why would you call somebody the N word with two Black people and over something so trivial? Eventually, she takes a step in the opposite direction and comes back and just spits at me and my wife, and it gets on us. So at that time, eventually the police come, but it's at that moment that you have to make a decision.
Mhm.
And your decision will be based on, of course, your trauma response, how you feel it's best to defend yourself in that moment, but also, too, what I'm more concerned with now and what I talk to a lot of schools and kids about in organizations is like, well, how do we respond after the incident, after the harm is done? Because some folks may have felt compelled to physically fight, understandable. Some folks may have been into much of a state of trauma, understandable. But from that moment, when we went home, I posted the video online to get justice because they kicked her out. They didn't arrest her. The police grabbed her and kicked her out, but there was no type of discipline or whatever. So in my mind, it's like I got to get justice, right? But now I'm getting, I guess I would say, frustrated because oftentimes when I started to get interviewed, people would always ask about that, but they were only concerned about that harm. And I felt like I had to let people know that as a black person, the hate crime, if we deal with the hate crime, that's usually like we already dealt with racism. And it's a hurtful thing, but that's not probably to me the most racist thing you can experience. To me, the most racist thing you can experience is an entire system set upon trying to attempting to make you become a failure, attempting to like make sure you are at the bottom of the totem pole on the caste system. That's more malicious. Like the hate crime is like if you are, what I'm saying, playing a basketball season since we're in the playoffs,
Mhm.
and a player just goes off like for 50 points in the game and you lose that one game, they dunk on you, cross you over. It's like, dang, that looked bad. But the system that's the issue is like having the plays, having the players, having everything in motion to get a desired result at the end of every single game. So people look at the highlights, but I'm trying to bring up the fact that, yeah, you see this one game because they score 50, but I'm trying to tell you every single game they're attacking us. And they do it in very benign and malicious ways. So the book was a way for me to present to people the ways in which we are impacted on a individual level. So I'm not just teaching about things I don't know or didn't experience.
Mhm.
Every chapter is about something I experienced, something I perceived, and then I'm connecting it to broader Black and American and world historical issues so that people gain this bigger picture. Saved my life because if we don't know this history, then we go wayward, then we go the way that this system wants us to, and that ultimately, in many ways, can lead to a short death, literally and figuratively.
No, absolutely. And then, of course, just that experience, yes, it is triggering, yes, it is emotional, and it all depends on how you react to it. But again, as you mentioned, the system has you reliving it, has you re-engaging in a way that will only further frustrate you, further anger you, further, throw you off the edge, so to speak, in terms of how to be able to take that information, digest it, and go, this is madness. Why is it not changing? Why is it not? And then, of course, using the historical references to know that, yeah, this occurred way back however many years ago. This is what was done. This is what was, the steps and tools needed to overcome. So
Yep.
it's about learning all this resistance, learning that empowerment, and how you can be able to navigate through all of that. So, which I really liked in terms of how everything was presented. And then, of course, the book emphasizes using, of course, Black history as a tool to combat racism. Could you
Yes.
just kind of elaborate on how historical narratives can empower individuals and communities today?
Yes. So I live in a country, I'm not sure if you know, if your listeners know, where there's a war against our history, against Black history. And this is not something that's new. This is something that has happened since we were forced to come over here. We were forced to take different names. We were forced to have different beliefs and not allowed to use our native tongues. And um, when we were separated from our families, when it was illegal for us to read and write. This is a perpetual war against us. It's a war on our collective memory. So when I talk about how it can combat or how these narratives can help us actively fight, it's essentially you can't fight against something that you don't know is the problem. Now it can continue to attack you, but unless you know that it's the problem, it's it's going to be a perpetual thing, right? I mean, it's almost like though, like I mean, it's like cancer. A lot
Mhm.
of times people don't know like how close they are to having that tumor because we don't actively see what's going on beneath the surface. But if you go to your checkups regularly, right? If you go to the doctor regularly, if you get more educated on it, then you're able to see and realize what could potentially be happening. So it's a war on our history, meaning that it's a war on how we can imagine ourselves and what we can perceive to be as a problem. If you are able to figure out what happened in maybe in the 1800s during enslavement or during the Civil War in 1861 or whatever, and there will be certain things that occur then that draw a direct line to things you are experiencing now. At the same time, when you come across people who proactively fought against it, you
Mhm.
are inspired to say, well, how can I imagine myself doing that today? It's
Mhm.
the same way. An example will be a person I mentioned in the book named John Barry Meacham. He was a pastor. He and his wife created a school in his church in St. Louis. Eventually, Missouri outlaws educating Black people, free or enslaved, period, in the mid 1800s. So he then decides creatively to say, well, what can I do to still serve my people? So then he gets a steamboat and he takes all his resources, all his materials, and puts it on the steamboat at the Mississippi River, which is off the land of Missouri, the state. So you creatively strategize. When you learn about Robert Smalls and what he did to free himself, taking control of a Confederate ship during the Civil War, and then going back for his family after going into free territory. It fills you with pride, but then it also makes you say again, now what does that look like today? So when we come across these things, it empowers us. One of the reasons why white folks can succeed so well in our education system, outside of the fact that they have been able to profit off of genocide and enslavement, that's a big factor, right? But also too, the school system implicitly reminds them of positive aspects of their history, right? Even if we mention genocide and enslavement, we don't mention it as like the at the forefront. It was all unfortunately this happened. So we're gonna focus on some heroic things that our presidents did. They might not even be true, but it's just we're gonna focus on making George Washington like this godly figure or whatever. Outside of that is reinforced in the media. So they'll see themselves as superheroes. We were happy to see Black Panther. I was a grown man when I saw that. Imagine if I saw that when I was 6. You know, I didn't see an Obama until I was about to graduate from college. So like, but they regularly see themselves as the norm for leadership, for humanity. It's not just school. It's not just the media. It's religion, regardless of what you believe in. We know that the most widespread popular religion is Christianity. You go to church, black, white church, you're going to see a white Jesus. So you now see yourself as God, as a savior. It's all of this. So then you have to think on the opposite end. Then what are black children seeing? They're not seeing themselves as heroes. They're seeing themselves as villains, even though they dealt with one of the worst human atrocities known to man, right? We're not seeing ourselves as heroes on the screen either until recently, but it's still rare. We're not seeing ourselves as our own savior. So what are we to think about ourselves? So Black history brings in this counter narrative and says, no, that's not actually true. This is who you truly are. So if we can then imagine ourselves how we were then. Human nature is I'm going to reimagine how I am now, which means I'm going to better imagine what it could be in the future. And when you know about all the things that happened then that were against us and how we fought back, you wouldn't dare put up with any of the current travesties that you see now, even beyond just the racial dynamic of Black history. It's the history of why race was even created to divide and conquer in working class people. So for me, at its core, it's a way for us to reimagine, for like to fill ourselves with these images so that we can create something better ultimately.
No, I couldn't agree with you more on that because it's that image that is needed, and it's very powerful, that image, to be able to know. And of course, just even if we are taking, let's say, slavery, because that's not all of our history, there are so many different layers within that alone that we've only heard only one message out of that
Mhm.
entirely. So, again, in I don't know if you can just be able to just to say, I guess, in certain ways that the book does provide strategies for parents and
Mhm.
educators to address racism within schools and, of course, foster equity.
Yeah, yeah. I think combining that with even your previous question, I think like even from the first chapter, I think people get that example. So I'm not like explicitly telling you what to do, but you should be able to pull from that. You know, when my mom is dealing with the teacher calling me bad, Black history intercedes and says, "Well, not my child is not actually bad. There's a literal conspiracy to like, as the title of the book that I reference in my book is called, to destroy black boys, to show,
Mhm.
to tell us and show us that we're not worthy, or that we're not good enough, that we're not intelligent. That was happening to me in the early 90s. And now, as of this recording, like, many of the conversations center around, why aren't black boys going to college? Why aren't they at HBCUs? And this past weekend we were talking about Shadur Sanders and what does it mean to be too confident as a black boy, or what does it mean for a star athlete to have his father in his life, and how that is viewed versus when a white father is around and very present. So all of these examples are interceding to say, again, don't believe these white lies, right? Or even the chapter when I talk about having been immersed in an environment where all I saw was white presidents, but then have living in an environment where at home all I saw was myself as royalty. So again, it's that counter to the lies. And when you see something like that and you see how I fall through it, whether you agree with it or not, you're able to say, well, if I have children in school, are they dealing with something similar? And what I found was, and that's one of the reasons I really wanted to write the book, everything I've dealt with, if you remove the dates, are very similar to what kids still deal with now. And it's very similar to what kids dealt with 20 years prior to me. I'm not really saying anything new, but some of the stuff in the book could potentially be something that other generations didn't have an opportunity to write about, or maybe just not within the same parameters of living through the 90s and the early 2000s.
And not only that, just to believe that you can provide a different narrative as well. That is,
Yes.
extremely powerful in and of itself, just to have that in a written word and read it from black and white type of thing, right? So,
Yes.
and what else would you say to someone who believes that their family history isn't important enough to be part of the larger black historical narrative? What would you say to that?
I think that, I think naturally, for example, if you were to find out that a grandparent that you never knew or met was like a business tycoon that owned a bunch of land somewhere down south, you would be filled with an immense amount of pride. And you first thing you probably say is, well, do we still own that land, right? Or like, what can we do to go get that land? Or matter of fact, if we don't, can we go see it? Or what happened to the land, especially with our history? Was it stolen? Can we go get it back? Whatever. So like, just something that small. Or if you were to find, like, why do we think in America, like, why do we think Bronny James has the access he has? It's because his father is LeBron. Direct history, direct lineage. Everything that he did paved the way for his son. Regardless how people feel about his son being in the NBA, LeBron did the exact same thing that white folks have done for themselves all the time, right? Same thing with Dion and Shador. Like, Dion paved the way with football, with his mentality, with his with the confidence he exuded for his son. Although he still is still having a somewhat of a difficult time, it still made it slightly easier. So I think that's important for us to understand as well.
Mhm.
I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
No, no, that's okay. That's okay. Because, no, because basically what you're just, saying is that these examples are what is needed, and to show that fathers being involved, or any parent, whether it's
Yeah,
a mother as
right,
well, to be able to provide resources, to be able to provide that opportunity to their offspring is massive. And
yeah,
that,
okay,
and
yep,
then of course on that scale, it's much bigger, it's much broader, because more people are seeing it, so it's being way more impactful than normally, than, let's say, if it was just, yourself or myself with, with your own child type of thing. So
yep,
where maybe a couple of people would see it, this is on a much, much larger platform, to know there is power in what they're doing as well. And as you said, white people have been doing it for generations.
right. I found it, yeah. And the point I was making, thank you for that. The point I was making was, if we would get pride in something that close, whether it be a father, grandfather, what would it mean for us to find out somebody 100 or 200 years ago? And I always tell kids, because even when you have to do like lineage assignments and things like that, to trace your family tree, it's always difficult for African American students, because even if we know our census records, eventually you'll have to come to a stop because you might be listed as items and things like that. But I always tell folks, why do you think an entire system would be created to focus on you and people that look like you? Why do you think they would go through so much to make you forget? Like, why do you think that is? And the only answer you can come through is, again, going back to a sports analogy, is if you create an entire system that's focused on, let's say, the star player on another team, that means deep down that you believe that that's the person that will defeat you. Now, how we have been historically is we're not focusing on literally defeating people. But I
Mhm.
think through that Western concept, the idea is if we, what they perceive as achieving more or have more, or have access to more resources, then they would look at that as if they're losing, as opposed to seeing how we can all collaborate as a human family. But and that's why learning about African history is so important for us too, so that we can see what that looked like before they attempted to cut off that connection we have.
Exactly. And then, of course, I guess this is part of my next question, which is the reclaiming and, of course, teaching Black history challenge, of course, the existing narratives, and, of course, contribute to dismantling the racist system. Would you be able to speak a little bit on that?
Yeah, so like here's my theory.
Mhm.
If we are to teach children the truth about African American history, Latino history, indigenous history, all of our shared histories, Asian history, especially on this landmass, and we do it in an age appropriate manner from the time, let's just say, let's start at the age of first grade, right? By the time kids graduate from high school, 12 years later, they are able to vote in America, right? What do you think happens to a group of children who have been educated progressively in that manner by the time they're 18? There is no denying that they would advocate for reparations for groups of people who have been disenfranchised perpetually. There's no denying that. So it's sometimes when we look at history so much as like just a subject or a story. History is us studying why things are the way they are now, essentially. So let's look at the status of everything now. Okay, how did we get there? Let's look at this. Let's investigate. Let's do some research. And we extract from that what we need to move forward, and we push back the things that we don't want anymore. If we teach kids that I mean, I think that's the foundation of saying African Americans deserve reparations, indigenous people deserve you know what I'm saying? Like it's common sense. So that's why the fight is intensified. So not only in our country are they focused on tariffs on the high end, not only are they focusing on deporting people on this federal end, but on a grassroots level, they're saying we're going to attack them on all ends. We're going to eliminate them. We're going to continue to be complicit with genocide, and we're going to erase that from their memory. So by the time their kids are old enough, they don't even learn about how we're disenfranchising them right now. So we cannot liberate ourselves unless we first realize what has continued to happen.
Mhm. No, definitely, definitely. And then could you speak to, I guess, what role does, mentorship and, of course, intentional environments play in empowering Black youth according to your findings?
Yes, yes. So there are a couple parts in the first two sections that talk about the role mentorship played in my life, particularly in college, when I almost flunked out. I accidentally found a mentor, and he was, inviting all the male or the black males on campus to come to a meeting, and I went because there was free food. And again, it changed my life and saved my life because I'm on the cusp of potentially not being back at this school. And because I started going to these meetings consistently, I was able to learn different ways that I could get my grades back up while also finding something I was passionate about. And this particular guy was working on his PhD, so seeing him working on his PhD in education was even inspiring to me and had a big impact. So I'm surrounded by black men on campus, although we were a minority, but I'm surrounded by black men in my circle. Every dude on that campus had to have a certain pedigree to get there. But all the people who inspired me to teach were people like him. He's working on his PhD. I got several black professors that are speaking life into me and teaching me these truths. So like that's direct mentorship and indirect mentorship. A mentor is essentially saying, I've made it this far and I want to help you make it to where I am too. People can only teach others what they've personally experienced. So for anybody who has achieved something great or has overcome something great, I think it's our obligation to say there are probably other people who dealt with that. How can I help them out? My main reason for wanting to even become a teacher outside of loving history was because I wanted to mentor. I felt history was the best way to mentor. That's the truth about it. I think it's the best way. I give maybe English a second, a second on that list, because in a history class, we could talk about anything. We could write about anything. I can connect anything in a history class to what's going on today politically. I can't do that in any other classes. And through that, I can mentor people. The first thing I did when I became a teacher outside of teaching in the class was mentor. We did the program at the high school I was at, brother to brother. So like there's an obligation. And although they weren't really using that term in previous generations, that's what all of our great leaders did. When they, I mean, who's a greater leader than Harriet Tubman, a mentor than Harriet Tubman, right? She gained freedom and she's going back to show people the way. Who's a greater mentor than like a Frederick Douglass or a Booker T, or W.E.B. Du Bois? Oftentimes, what we do in these Western societies is we look at the individual, but we forget about everybody that poured into them, and then we forget about their tree. Because if we look at who they impacted, I mean, for instance, we know Dr. King, like there is no Reverend Jesse, there is no Al Sharpton, there are William Barber, there are several people who come from that lineage. So to me, it's our duty as all humans, especially those who have in our community who deal with an onslaught of isms and prejudice.
No, and I like that you use that reference of pouring into, because that is huge. And again, it brings that whole community aspect of everything as well. And,
Yes.
Your book, addresses the challenges for Black parents face in navigating the educational system, because that is a big one. And not
Yeah.
everybody is equipped to be able to come up to some of the forces. What were some of the solutions that you had proposed?
Yeah, so in terms of advocating for your children within the school system, I think one of the things we have to realize is, and again, the benefit I had was my mom was in the school system. She was a teacher, she's an educator, but you don't have to. You don't have to have seen that or experienced that. Like you don't have to be rich to put your children in a position to be more financially successful. You just have to know that you want better for them and then to find a way to get them better education. It's really the desire. Like the most important thing I've realized in life a lot of times is having the ambition to do better, right? I mean, like we look at people like, again, going back to our folks, like the folks in the 1800s that we admire for fighting against slavery didn't go to school to learn how bad slavery was. They didn't take a test. They didn't, it's because they were experiencing it, but they also had the ambition to say, I deserve better than this. Something just, they had the intuition. Something ain't right. We deserve better. I ain't seen it, but I know it's something better out there. So, like, if you, as every child, every parent, especially Black parents, should know, like, I have to speak up for my child more than any other parent does, especially if they are a minority at their school. Because if I don't, who's going to look out for them? So just the ambition of wanting your kids to do more. You can follow the examples in my book, like my mom speaking up in defense, understanding that those teachers serve you. Like you all are the customers. You pay tax money at a public school for them to provide a service. And if it's not being provided equitably with morality, then you have the obligation to speak up. I always recommend that people first, again, contact educators and be clear on what you expect for your child. Be clear if your child is a minority at that school. Be clear that you want that teacher to see their color, not to treat them in an inferior fashion, but recognize that they have different needs because of the background and the history and all of that type of stuff. I'm always an advocate too, speaking up to administrators, speaking up, going to school board meetings. These are things that are not a popular practice of people of any demographic, but these are things that make a difference. I think what I also saw too was my mom even just modeling how to challenge authority, getting pulled over by police, and my mom is modeling how to file a police report. Like that's intimidating. As a Black man, you go into a police report to file a police report against the people who and unjustly pulled you over. And it wasn't about the fact that something would actually happen to them, but it's the fact that you have the authority, you have the right to go face to face with those people and say this was the harm that was done. So more than anything in that book, I think that people will get to be audacious, ambitious, and be audacious. You don't have to know it all. You don't have to know all of these Black history facts to teach your kids Black history. We have more resources than any other time. Google it, Chat GPT it. How do I best advocate? What can I do to what resources? Like it's we just have to say something got to give. This ain't right the way it is now, and I want better. You're gonna see that all throughout the book, especially the first section.
Yeah, absolutely. No, those are great examples because it is challenging to be able to then be in a position where you're asking, you are now demanding in a way to ask for change. And that is definitely for some terrifying, right?
Mhm.
So, um, what was, I guess, the most, I guess, surprising or the enlightening story you discovered while researching this book?
That's a great question. I think one of the most enlightening things that I probably came across was I think just finding these connections between who we are as people in North America with who we were and still are in Africa. I was actually creating a post before we got on the call. And it was about like, so if anybody who's seen Sinners recently with Ryan Coogler, I don't want to give a, have you seen it?
I haven't really yet, no.
Okay, well, I'll just reference this then. So there, I mean, he draws an explicit connection between blues music, black music, and music in Africa. And there's a particular scene where you will see some African dance that is very similar to how people dance over here, especially in Chicago, where I'm from. So I think just like the chapter about my friend who was from Nigeria, who in many ways taught me about how we're all connected still. I think when I was doing research on that to really dig on just how close is that connection between us and our West African brothers and sisters who are there right now. And I was just amazed to see that, like, it's almost like you might have a cousin. Really, we ain't seen in 200, 300 years, potentially 400 years, but we dance the same. We like have, talk the same in many different languages, but we talk the same. And so I think seeing that and seeing the connection between explicitly with the Chicago footwork and there was like a African dance naming tradition ceremony in West Africa, Cote d'Ivoire. I think I'm saying that incorrectly, but the way they dance in that ceremony is so similar to how we dance, and I'm thinking like, how did that dance style we call it footwork, right? How did that dance style go from West Africa across the Middle Passage, through the South to Mississippi, up through the Great Migration to Chicago, and exist in a way in which when I was in high school, when we would go to parties and stuff, they would clear it. And anybody who can do that dance would do that dance. We think that's something we created. Now we remixed it, but I think just finding the every time I was digging to find a connection with Africa, I was just amazed to see how closely linked we are. And I hope that's one of the things people get from this book too, is understanding that this thing is a social construct and we have a broader world community out there to connect to. The things that we deal with in America, Canada, and otherwise, these are things that are like not completely unique to what other folks are. Now, I want to be clear. Now, when I'm talking about the impact of chattel slavery, that is definitely unique. But in terms of like what we have overcome, who we are as people, they say they stripped everything from us when we were forced over here, but that's not true. They tried to strip the material things, but as Dr. Daniel Black often says, like Africa is in us. We came over here with that, but we maybe have not been so clear as to name it the same way they were able to name it then, but it still oozes out of us every chance we get, every time we talk, walk, speak, interact with each other, all of it.
All of it, absolutely all of it, because we just may not know the source of it, but this is
It's
how
there.
it's there. It's there in many ways. And, what advice would you give to individuals who want to become more active in anti-racist work, but don't know where to start?
I would go back to the conversation we had about parents. I would just say like start with the ambition. So what do you want to improve? Like, there are so many things and it can be overwhelming. I get overwhelmed sometimes too. So if you are committed to anti-racism, well, that means we got to even think of that from a different perspective. Being against racism means you want to have a just society. where people's status in life isn't determined by their skin color. What aspect of that do you want to get involved in? Political advocacy,
Mhm.
educational advocacy, media advocacy, representation, right? Do you work in the religious sphere? Are you like a organizer? Do you want to be on the forefront of something? Do you want to be behind the scenes? So I think like, and for me, it's not like I had to really think about this a lot, but it's like, what's the thing that you can't stop thinking about? That's the thing that you want to do. Like it was always I didn't grow up wanting to be a teacher, but I began to realize that I was attracted to learning about us and sharing it with people. In the career field that most fit that strength was teacher. So what's the thing about anti-racism that really pulls you to wanting to stand up? I would say focus on that. And I would say read as much as possible. But after you read, think about how you can get engaged locally. And again, that can be overwhelming. So what I would tell people is go to a school board meeting, go to a city council meeting, and look at what's being done in your local community or jurisdiction. See if there's have been any issues of racism in your city, your town, or school. And and then if there have, go to the school board meeting and ask for an update. When you become bold like that, you begin to attract other people who have that same energy or are attracted to it. Literally, when I dealt with that hate crime, the following summer, that was my question. I said, okay, I'm starting to create, I'm starting to public speak, but I'm talking about all of these other things that are happening across the country. But what about my community? I started Googling. I said, oh man, there's a lack of Black owned businesses here, but this town has 20% Black folks. So I go to a city council meeting. I ask a question about it. And then from that point, I began to be viewed as a person in my community that had a bold voice, and I attracted people with a similar mindset.
No, absolutely. Because once you start walking into your light, your truth, your power comes to the forefront. So, in what ways do you think, family histories can challenge dominant historical narratives and fill the gaps left by traditional education?
Oh, great question. Essentially, speaking from experience, when we teach history, we teach it from the settler colonial perspective. So again, going back to the remarks I made about George Washington, I can think about like pretty much all the subjects in my head. I taught this stuff 12 years straight. I taught U.S. history every single year, but I always try. I always, not want to say try. I always put in that Black perspective. I taught a lot of Latino students. I will put in that Latino perspective too. But in my mind, I already know it's American Revolution. It's westward expansion. It's sectionalism. It's the causes of the Civil War. It's Reconstruction. It's imperialism. It's so like just from that, we're studying history from the perspective of the empire. It's what the empire deemed important. So every unit we're talking about the president. We're talking about some of the lesser known, some of the political figures too, Democrats, Republicans, whatever at that time. And then we might talk about a few prominent figures who fought against that. That leaves so much to be known, though, right? Because with that, we're leaving out, well, what was the experience of the everyday person that woke up and was forced to go into that plantation every day? Or what was the experience of that person after enslavement who was a sharecropper, who fled to the north, fled to the south? So that's why reading primary sources are so important. And that's why in this era, in this generation, I encourage folks to create those future primary sources by interviewing family members. If you got kids, have your kids interview you. I know it's hard for us to envision this, but one day we'll be a part of the historical record. One day people will listen to this to get a better understanding of what life was like in 2025. So I'm always, in many ways, when you study enough of history, you then begin to think about what the future is going to look like. And I know with everything that I do, that's going to be, if we still have all of this, that's going to be public record in the future. But also as well, like I think there's so much to be said about, especially those of us who have family members in the Black community who lived through Jim Crow apartheid. We have to document that with the same intensity as people documented those who were enslaved. During the Great Depression, they went around interviewing Black people who were in their 80s, 90s, sometimes 100, and asked them about what that experience was like. That's way different than us writing about it based on what a white politician said. You hearing it right from their mouth, what they dealt with, right? So we got to do that same thing with this generation. People who, might have been born in the 50s and before. What was that experience like for you? Because that is us taking back our narrative. And then how we do things now, we can begin to create our own history books on a mass scale, not just the ones that go to these huge districts, but like community history books.
Absolutely, because there's many migration stories, and
Hmm.
all, some do come into the United States, but the ones that are more known are, of course, of non-Black or non-brown skin
Right.
tones, right? So those ones, definitely what you mentioned is just, absolutely fantastic. And then, of
Yep.
course, we're coming to a close here to this great discussion. What would you say in terms of the impact? What would you like the impact of your book? How can Black History Save Your Life have on the readers and society at large?
I want my book to serve as a foundation for people standing up for the
Mhm.
better society. I think there's so many ways I can go with that, but I think, and especially if you get to the very end of the book, I mean, I don't want to give stuff away, but like you should feel like there's a call. Like it's almost like now what? Okay, you fill in the rest. You know what I'm saying? I want people to read the book and begin to process the ways in which they have been miseducated the same way I had to. I couldn't write that book if I didn't read Carter G. Wood's Miseducation of the Negro. So I want us to reflect on, wow, I've been taught wrong on purpose.
Mhm.
And I want them, like if you are, let's say, white, I want you to get a better idea of how you can advocate for communities outside of your own. Because if you say you were an ally, it's hard because you've never lived that experience, right? So with my book, because I was in so many different spaces, you're able to see what that harm was like, elementary level, college level, working in a white space. If you are black or, as we say, people of color, I would say that I hope that it gives you courage because I didn't get my courage until I dealt with a hate crime, but it shouldn't take that. We should already have enough memory of the hate crimes that have happened and happen now to say that we have to speak up. And how you decide to do that is completely up to you. I choose to speak. I choose to write. I choose to create content and various other things. Your path might be different, but we need all voices, all hands on deck if we really want to make this a better society for us all.
No, absolutely. And then the example that you provided in the book is just a great basis point to jump off from, and as well to be able to relate as to similar experiences, right? To be able to use that, as you said, use all of that, whichever space that you happen to be in, to be able to advocate. And even though that it is scary at times, you just
Yeah,
have to walk even while you're scared to be able to do it because it will
yeah,
make a difference. It will be an impact and people will see it and know that
yeah.
it's different. So again, Ernest, I just want to thank you so much for coming
Thank you.
onto the podcast, taking the time to be able to discuss this, and all the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.